It's really good to be with you tonight. Thank you for coming. You obviously are the diehards. Anyone that would come out on an evening, a beautiful evening, to listen to me talk about this kind of a topic has to have some genuine concern. And you're here not for yourself, I would suspect. You're here for your children and probably your grandchildren. So I hope you'll take away tonight some things that you can use. One of the first things that I like to say is that, because parents often say to me, if a child is questioning, now this is a big thing in our schools, they're all questioning their identity. Everyone has to have an identity. When I went to school, there was no such thing as identity. You conformed, you kind of fit in. And so it's so different. It's so different for our children. So bless you for being here, because we're going to talk about some pretty serious things. And I'm going to talk about the danger of gender affirmation, gender affirming care. That's what it's called when we choose, and the school system and the clinicians, doctors, and psychologists choose to affirm a child who would say that they are born in the wrong body, or they feel like they are a male when they're a girl. So that's kind of what the focus is tonight. So let's begin. This has happened to so many parents. When your doctor says, do you want a live son or a dead daughter? This is kind of one of the lines predominantly within the medical system, psychological associations, and certainly this is what children are actually coached to tell their parents if their parents choose anything other than affirming their idea of who they are. In 2019, a Vancouver psychologist by the name of Wallace Wong was recorded on video recommending that youth threaten suicide if parents would not comply with affirming their delusion. And I'll call it a delusion. What we need to understand is that up until 2013, there was a diagnosis for gender identity disorder. So these are the gender dysphoric children that are confused about cross-sex identifying. And it was a mental issue. It was a mental health issue. They could be diagnosed. Now we can diagnose, therapists can diagnose as gender dysphoric, but really that is just saying that the child is struggling. They're anxious. They're discomfortable with their sexuality, with their sex, and would rather be an opposite sex. So this is what this Dr. Wong said to children. What you need is, pull a stunt. Pull a stunt. Suicide every time. He's instructing the children to declare they will kill themselves. And then the parents, will give you what you want. This is the kind of manipulation that's happening. This is a psychologist. In fact, this psychologist has 500 foster care children in his practice. He's transitioning most of them. Wow. He has a one-way ticket, this person. And what he's doing is calling people good. So the prevalence, and I'm going to quickly go through some of these slides. I will make them available. This video will be available, I would think, at some point, Asa? Yeah. Fewer than 1 in 10,000 adult natal males, so adult males. And 1 in 30,000 adult females experienced gender dysphoria. This was 2016, up until 2016. Now, what's happened is this whole area of gender confusion has so gone upside down that it's now, instead of the boys being predominantly the ones who want to transition, it's girls. 50 to 90%, 4 should be in there, of the clinical samples are young girls. And I'm not going to go into all this because I don't have time tonight, but it's called, it is deemed a social contagion. And a researcher by the name of Lisa Littman in the US did a paper for Browns University, which they subsequently, she had to retract some things in it. They were truth and they didn't want that to get out. But basically determined that this is a social contagion, and the girls now represent 85%, at least 85% of those who are transitioning. And those girls are usually between 13 and 20, 22, 23, young girls. That was in 2018. The ages have dropped. It's dropped significantly. So there are no objective tests. You cannot test for gender dysphoria. There's no true transgender child. There just isn't. And transgender itself is not a psychological or medical term. It's a political term. The real term is transsexual. But all of those terms, the terminology, everything, when we talk about language, there's so much that has been so distorted with the language. And so now instead of transsexual, we have transgender. But by adulthood, the vast majority of children who were actually diagnosed were able to desist. By the time they reached puberty or just after they were through puberty, the vast majority of these children, and most of them boys, desisted. They decided they were okay with their body. Many of them became homosexual. And so there still were some things, happening there. But there's no way we can determine who will persist with gender dysphoria and who won't. And yet, our medical system and psychological system continues in Canada to have one way only, and that is affirmation only. And that kind of has taken over the whole system. And it's in the schools. Children diagnose themselves, teachers diagnose. People who have no right diagnosing anything are now the clinicians, so to speak. So I'm going to throw this into, just to give you a little bit more understanding. Maybe you've seen this in the past. Tavistock Clinic, you can see where 2009, there were 72 boys, 56 girls. So Tavistock was the biggest gender clinic in the UK, and probably the best at that time. And they had a small percentage, and those were children that came from all over Europe to be treated there. By 2018, look at the stats. And in 2001, there were more than 5,000 referrals. When you think, globally, or even in Europe, 5,000 children still isn't a lot of children, but it's a whole lot more than 150. And so the trajectory was just going off the charts. I think the percentage was that it had gone up 4,400% in, I don't want to say how many years, it was pretty, I think it was 2009 up. Anyways, I don't have that right off the top of my head, but what it did was initiate the CAST review, which you may have heard of, and in just this May actually, Tavistock closed its doors, gender clinic doors. That's good news. The not so good news is that they farmed out the clinics into smaller clinics around England. So they're still doing the work, a lot of it. Maybe not as much, and certainly they've had to pull back on some things because the CAST review actually showed how evil hormones, puberty blockers, and the results were. I'll get into that in a little while. So here's some more data. In 2014, the cross-sex prevalence rate in the US was 0.6% or 1.4 million people. So that's people who identified as transsexual mostly. And then 2020 to 21, the number of children aged 6 to 17 diagnosed, so these are the ones that are actually diagnosed with gender dysphoria, increased 70%. 70%. Do you think we have a problem in our education system? Because that's where so much of it is happening. What they're being told in school, what they're being told by their peers, and social media, which is such a huge problem. And so many children have such free access to any, to Reddit and to all kinds of sites that really do promote transitioning in a big way. So by 2021, 1 in 100 now identify as transgender. 100. This is a contagion. Comorbidities, so here I'm going to talk about bad news. I'm going to get some good news at the end. But this is no different than children with other forms of psychological distress or mental illness. We need to look at it at that level. Certainly, that's not what our government wants us to do. They don't want it being classified as a mental illness. But these children are disturbed. They're disturbed. And for one reason or another. And they present with a multitude, maybe that's the wrong word, but it seems like multitude, of interacting risk factors. So these children usually have some pretty significant trauma in their history. And that could be anything from divorce in the family to sexual abuse, to extreme bullying, all kinds of stuff, loss and trauma, family conflict, loss of family cohesion, and exposure to just a whole range of different things that have impacted them, adverse childhood effects in their lives. They have multiple pre-existing mental health concerns, including, this is probably the newest research, and there's a QR code at the end of this PowerPoint, so any place where you don't see the reference at the bottom of the slide, it'll all be on the QR code, so you have all the references. But a recent 2023 study showed that the majority of these children have an existing diagnosis, the majority of these children, on the autism spectrum. These are the most vulnerable of our children that are being targeted. And if they haven't been diagnosed, many are likely to be diagnosed with autism. They have histories of self-harm. They cut. They've tried all kinds of things. Suicidal ideation. And you're going to hear this. Of course, this is the big thing. I'll kill myself. But we have to look deeper than what's happening, when they all of a sudden decide they're in the wrong body. There have already been so many other things happening in their lives. And the reason, from my experience and from what I believe when I understand trauma and attachment disorder, is that trauma is the underlying foundation of so many mental health issues. Most of them actually have some aspect of deep trauma. And those who are deeply traumatized are highly suicidal. You don't have to be transgender to be suicidal. So they have those kind of symptoms, sleeping disorders, ADHD, many of them are ADHD. A lot, especially the girls, interestingly enough, struggle with oppositional defiance and conduct problems. They have a 2 to 3-fold increased risk of psychiatric disorders. That does not go away when they're on puberty blockers and hormones. No matter what you're reading, and some of the science, the research will say it does. Be careful, you must read research with a very, a critical eye. in understanding it. I don't understand all of it. I look to some of my wonderful peers who really are top-notch researchers to explain some of the methodology and some of the things that are just not good research. So they have a lot of extenuating circumstances that bring them to this point. So suicidality is considered consistently higher for the girls and strongly associated with the degree of behavioral conduct and emotional problems that they have. So you're looking at all these conduct problems, trauma, family problems, and then you heap on top of that this idea that they have suddenly taken hold of, that they are transgender, and you put that on top. And what we're getting is a real mess. These kids are just desperate for help. And when they reach out for help, and the parents reach out for help, they get affirming care only in Canada. And that's a tragedy. A 2020 pediatric study said that those who received puberty blockers were twice as likely to have a suicide attempt, resulting in inpatient care in the last 12 months. So puberty blockers and hormone therapy are touted as the be-all and end-all for these children, that they must get on puberty blockers, sometimes with as little as a half-hour interview with the doctor, their family doctor, or a psychologist. And Planned Parenthood, which isn't as big in Canada, but in the States, Planned Parenthood now prescribes puberty blockers and hormones. And they have no follow-up care for these children. No follow-up care. Contrary to popular narrative, the Haines Directory reports that studies show the prevalence of suicide attempts was not affected. That means it didn't go down. So we need to understand that there are not less suicide attempts once the child starts transitioning and goes into the medical route. Once they go on drugs, it does not lessen their suicidal ideology, their suicidal ideation. In fact, it actually can increase it. Andrea Longchamp is a journalist, and if you Google him, he's male who identifies as a transgender woman. He debunked the assertion that hormones reduce suicidality because he stated that I wasn't suicidal before hormones. Now I often am. It hasn't changed his trajectory. He still identifies as a woman. He writes on sexuality. He has a strong voice in the trans community. But he spoke truth on this. So you have to just shake your head and say, okay, Canada, what's going on? What's going on in our medical system? What's going on governmentally, politically? Because as parents and grandparents, you will all be forced, if your child comes out to you, you will come right head to head with this whole aspect of having to lie to your child. Now you have a choice on that. That's why I say telling the truth is kind and it is loving, because no child deserves to be lied to. And it's going to come back to bite the parents, the teachers, the doctors, and there's some reverberations happening around the world with lawsuits. In the UK, there's over 1,000 lawsuits now. When I said Tavistock Clinic closed, there's over 1,000 lawsuits pending against Tavistock for transitioning the children. It hasn't come to Canada yet. There's one in Orillia, one girl in Orillia who is suing a doctor. We need to see this happening all across Canada, all across the U.S. There's a few in the U.S. That are starting to speak out. So here's some other stuff. This just corroborates what I was saying, the 2021 Australian report. Same kind of things happening. Family conflict, parental mental illness. Now let me speak to this, and I know this is really hard because parents say, well, you know, we're doing our best, and you are doing your best. But we have to recognize that sometimes there are mental illness issues, pre-existing mental illness issues with the parents. And previously, so this was in the 90s, I think 1994 perhaps, there was a study done on the mothers, the parents, but particularly the mothers of young boys who were they were diagnosed as gender identity disorder. 53% of those mothers had been diagnosed with bipolar. Sorry, that's wrong, not bipolar, borderline personality disorder. That's huge, 53%. And so we need to treat the whole family. And Ken Zucker, Dr. Ken Zucker from Toronto, who was the leader, I think, worldwide in treating children with gender identity disorder, treated the whole family. And he treated them successfully, because that's where the good stats come from, of those who once they got to be in their teens, desisted. He treated them with behavioral therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy. He was fired, came back from holidays and was fired in 2015 because CAMH had gone to gender affirming care only, and he didn't fit the bill, even though he's done research for 40 years. Anyways, so there's a lot of extenuating circumstances, and we've talked about that. The American Journal of Psychiatry actually has stated that there is no evidence that hormones or surgery help gender incongruent patients. Too bad they wouldn't put this in the paper. Too bad they wouldn't tell teachers. Too bad our education system wouldn't research what's being really spoken. The other thing is that affirming parents do not improve the stats for these children. And if you affirm a child's misguided sense of who they are, if they're misguided and you're telling them, yes, that's who you are exacerbating what's already happening and the mental illness that they are already struggling with, instead of getting them the help they need. Let's just spend a little bit of time on medical transitioning. And so this is specifically about puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and reassignment surgery. And I won't take a long time, this is an overview, right? And so most of this, in fact, I think all of this information is in my latest book, Ultimate Deception, so there's a lot more that we could talk about. So puberty suppression was introduced just in the early 2000s. It's not like this has been around for years, decades and, a century. And it was introduced by the Dutch clinicians. I'm just giving you some stats here. Supron LA, which is released, inserted, and it's a puberty blocker inserted, and it lasts for a year for the child. Not all children have insert under their skin. Some take injections, but it was originally developed for precocious puberty, which is a medical, a biological problem for some children. It's for children who, at 7 or 8 years old, enter puberty. And so medically, this was used to kind of, delay puberty for 3 or 4 years, and then they went off of it. It was not meant to not only suspend puberty, but stop it altogether. The cost, $44,000 a year. This is expensive. And so if we put a 10-year-old, which 10-year-olds are being put on puberty blockers in Canada, most of them are a little bit older, but It seems every year the age goes down. And they're going to be on puberty blockers for 3 or 4 years. It costs a lot of money to harm their bodies. Puberty blockers came with warnings. The psychiatric symptoms continue to be reported. And so there's a lot of emotional upheaval when these children, if they were having emotional upheaval before they went on puberty blockers, it's like going on steroids because there's all kinds of emotional things happening. When they go on hormones, it's even worse. And the doctors are to monitor for worsening symptoms. So you have to ask, why would any doctor put a healthy child on a medication that is going to worsen their psychiatric symptoms, that is going to create more problems than it would ever solve, and it's going to cost thousands and thousands of dollars? Well, there's several groups behind the scenes that are pushing. Big Pharma, the transgender movement, which is a huge movement, run by some very, very, very predominant billionaires. There's a lot of behind the scenes that goes into this. So desistance, though, is, and what's common, desistance and now detransitioning is becoming more and more common. There's a site for detransitioners, I think it's on X, which was Twitter. I think that's where it was, but there were 17,000 registered detransitioners. So this is not just here and there. These now adults who went through the puberty blocking and then started onto hormones going, I've messed my life up. I'm looking for help, but there's nobody to help them. The doctors who were there to make sure they got all the medication they needed to transition, they usually don't go back to those doctors because they don't have much faith in those doctors. And so they're often left on their own. So it's really one of the greatest scandals in medical history, and it's being revealed as that. After 1 year on puberty blockers, children reported more self-harm. Can you imagine parents who've been coerced into agreeing with their child, having to listen and to deal with this on their own? Parents are so traumatized and so left out in the cold with all of this. The children reported more self-harm, girls experienced more behavioral and emotional problems, and greater dissatisfaction with their body. As though they weren't having enough problems. Now they even are worse off. And so the puberty blockers actually exacerbate the gender dysphoria, the very thing they're supposed to make everything better from. So let's talk about some of the other risks, not only psychologically, but physically. So osteoporosis and repeated fractures later in life, and I don't mean really a long way down the road, in their late teens, in their 20s, their 30s, depending on the individual, of course. But more prone to fractures, more prone to all of those kind of things. Bone mineral density and growth and height is slowed. Because puberty, when you block puberty, that's the time when your body, of course, is at its greatest growth spurt. And these children are allowed. It's all taken away from them. They don't go through that growth spurt. And there's significant evidence now coming to suggest that it lowers cognitive ability. And that makes total sense to me because when a child goes through puberty, their brain recalibrates. You know, they go from black and white to thinking outside the box, right? That's the time when their brain really, really begins to mature. But what if you stop that? What if you stop that? So not only are we, damaging them physically and psychologically, but mentally as well. The cross-sex hormone therapy, number one, you can never change your sex. Your biological sex is your sex for life, no matter what the world will tell you. And that's why you have to tell your child the truth. You owe it to your child to tell them the truth. And to affirm who they are as a girl or a boy. And that God created them beautifully. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. So instead of, taking away something, we want to give them something back, who they really are. They're precious. We want to give them dignity. And there's never been this kind of experience when we talk about cross-sex hormones, so girls on testosterone and boys on estrogen, that it was never witnessed medically unless it was some kind of tumor, like hormones secreting tumor. But now we're seeing it all the time. Let's look at testosterone. The first thing I would say with girls on testosterone, and you may remember the shooting at the Christian school in the U.S. The minute I saw that and I looked, this was a male to female, but there's so much emotion from all of the puberty blockers and from the hormone. There's so much going on. It's no surprise that there's a lot of anger in this group of individuals, and we see it a lot. So here's the physical: heart attacks and strokes, breast and uterine cancer, diabetes, liver dysfunction, hypertension, liver cancer, acne. Women on testosterone are almost 4 times as likely to have heart attacks. So these are the repercussions physically. We're killing. This is all about annihilation. We're annihilating our children. Estrogen in males increases the rate of deep vein blood clots and strokes 3 to 5 times. After 8 years on estrogen, it's increased 16 times. So we are creating not only the greatest mental health crisis we've ever seen in the West, but also one of the greatest physical health crises we've ever seen. Incidence of breast cancer, so this is in transition males. The incidence of breast cancer is 46 times higher. 46 times higher. But the children are not told none of the risks that are associated with puberty blockers and hormones are getting out there to the parents and the children. It's all hidden. It's all good. It's all good. This is what your child needs to do. Remember Wallace Wong? Mm-hmm. And make sure you do everything you can to make sure your parents comply. Normal sexual functioning in the male will be impaired or absent altogether. In the female, it induces a menopausal state very early, like in their early 20s. These individuals, by the way, will be infertile for life. If they go on puberty blockers and then hormones, infertility is almost 100% guaranteed. They will never have biological children. But this was in the UK review. What they said was any potential benefits of gender-affirming care, gender-affirming hormones, must be weighed against the largely unknown long-term safety profile of these treatments in children and adolescents with gender dysphoria. So what was happening in, well, about 2019 onward, as these reviews were taking place, what they were finding was making them, put the skids on with gender affirming care in the UK. Not all of it there's still way too much of it, but there was an opening for some truth to be spoken. The reality, and I talked about this, never having biological children. But then in 2011, I'm going back and just talking about surgery for a minute before we get to the good stuff of what's happening in Sweden and Finland and other countries. In 2011, a Swedish study followed up on transgender surgery patients. And they've been following up for 30 years. So this was a really good longitudinal study. And what they found was that 10 years post-surgery, the suicide rates were nearly 20 times that of the general population. The suicide rates went up. They went up post-surgery. So not only after being on puberty blockers and hormones, the emotional instability worsens and suicidal ideation increases. But after surgery, 10 years after surgery, and what I believe about that is that, there comes a point in time in a person's life where they begin to understand and realize that they can never, ever truly be the opposite sex. And that all of the drugs, all of the surgeries have not made them happier, because that's what they were wanting, to be happier, and you don't get happiness in that way. So given the high rates of desistance, up to 97% in Ken Zucker's study with boys, along with continuing mental health issues and unknown physical complications from all of these drugs, unquestioning affirmation cannot be considered best practice. It should not be allowed. It should not be allowed in Canada. Our doctors should not be practicing affirmation. Medical doctors, psychologists, psychiatrists, they are harming our children. So here's some good news. I want to finish with some good news. I don't even know what it's trying to get. But anyways, Finland has rejected the routine affirmation of minors with gender dysphoria. So that means socially transitioning parents are not required to say, yes, Joey, you're Jennifer. They are not doing that. They're not forcing children or parents particularly, to affirm them. Doctors are not doing that in Finland. So it rejects routine. There will be special cases. There are some children that are generally struggling with deep mental health issues. We need to treat the mental health, and you don't treat it with another condition. 2021 in Australia, the results suggest that the need to address psychosocial trauma-informed model of therapy for these children. Yes, counseling, good, solid counseling. If you send a gender dysphoric child to a therapist in Canada, you will not get this kind of therapy. They will not be told the truth. They will be transitioned. They'll be put on that conveyor belt. And this is what's going to be stopped in Canada. France, 2022, said this. Trans identification, this was the Psychological Association. No genetic predisposition has been found. No matter what you read in mainstream media or the latest scientific journal, this is the truth. Transition interventions great medical caution must be taken in the vulnerability and the many undesirable effects of medical interventions, because what they're recognizing is that the most vulnerable children are the ones who are being transitioned. The ones who need mental health counseling, the real therapy, the most are the ones that are being transitioned. In Florida, 2022, you've probably heard of DeSantis and all he's done in Florida. He has just been bright light, and one of our colleagues, Dr. Andre Van Mol, was very much involved in presenting the research on that DeSantis used. There were several others. But this is what they said: social gender transition should not be a treatment option. What a bright light. If we could only have that in Canada. Only in Canada. Anyone under 18 should not be prescribed puberty blockers or hormone therapy. Gender reassignment surgery should not be a treatment option for children or adolescents. That means 13-year-old girls cannot have double mastectomies. In Canada, they can. And then they have to live with that for the rest of their lives. '23, this is just recent. Denmark has joined the Europeans that are backpedaling on gender affirming therapy. So what we're seeing is that the actual verifiable and valid research is having an effect. And it's coming to light. And other countries are seeing the light, but Canada is not. This, I believe, is the cry of many transgender adults. I want my sex back. And for many of them, it's too late. Because they can never have back what they lost. Thank you. This was kind of heavy, but I really want you to take information home with you. I left you with a card. What is this? Protect the Lambs. On the back of that is some just a few statistical points that you can use. It is really important that you don't go away from here and do nothing, because our children are worth more than that. We have to stand for truth for our children. A couple other things just as I quit, as I finish up. Dr. Scott Masson is here, but I'm doing on my podcast, I do a podcast, you find it on my website, RestoringTheMosaic.ca, and it's called Truth Talks. And so I'm doing a series right now on education that you might find very interesting, alternative education, and then some, hopefully, to help parents and grandparents with getting their children into places, schooling that is cost effective as possible, and will give them an education, not an indoctrination. So thank you, and thank you for coming, and I hope that you'll be in touch with me at some point.